Hello, everybody. I'm Ryan Urie, and I lead our food and commodities economics research group here at S&P Global Commodity Insights. And joined here today is Roger Bernard, who leads our policy analytics, particularly focused on the U.S. And with a lot of the changes with the new administration and potential upcoming biofuels policy, I thought it would be a good opportunity to bring Roger along and have him explain the current setup of the clean fuels production credit, also known as 45Z. So thanks for taking the time today, Roger. I will turn it over to you to highlight and line out all of the different aspects of this current policy. And we can talk about what it means here going forward and important watch points that we need to be looking for.
All right. Thank you very much, Ryan, and glad to be a part of all that's going on. The 45Z credit, as you mentioned, became effective on January 1 of this year. Now, when I say became effective, it at least has superseded prior biofuels policies, including the blender's credit that was available for biodiesel production. That ended at the close of 2024. And several of the other, like the sustainable aviation fuel credit, that also disappeared at the end of 2024. So now there is just this 45Z credit in place. Now, we had a sort of an anxious period leading up to the start of this year when we had the Biden administration continuing to signal they intended to put forth information on this 45Z credit before they left office, that of course being January 20. About 10 days before that, 5 to 10 days before that, they did finally come out with at least interim guidance on this 45Z credit. Now, that spelled out some of the information that a lot of people had been hoping to see relative to this 45Z credit and how it would work, but it is not the final word yet. In fact, really what was issued by the Biden administration at that point was a notice of their intention to come forward with a rule pertaining to the 45Z credit. Now, in combination with this 45Z credit being issued, the U.S. Department of Agriculture issued an interim final rule, this covering the technical guidelines for climate smart agriculture, or CSA, crop production for corn and soybeans, and they added sorghum compared to what was available under the Sustainable Aviation Fuel, or SAF, credit. This at least provides farmers with some perspective on the practices that they need to deploy in order to have their corn, soybeans, and now sorghum provide a more favorable carbon intensity rating for those producing the biofuel under the 45Z credit. Now, let me make a couple of points. First, also on this 45Z credit, the farmer does not get the credit. The credit is paid to the producer of the biofuel. So this is not something that the farmer themselves will get dollars from the government. We'll talk some more about this in a little bit, but that now leaves it to the biofuel producer to decide how much they're going to pay the farmer. So what farmers have to do under these CSA practices are deploy one of a series of practices, including no tillage or reduced tillage in their farming operation. Also, they have to use a favorable application for nitrogen, a smart application, if you will, also called nutrient management. The other, factors that come into play when we look at this is also on the situation with cover crops. Those also provide a favorable carbon intensity rating because, of course, they're capturing carbon and retaining it. Under the SAF credit that was announced in 2024, at least that was detailed in 2024, farmers had to undertake all of those CSA practices. Now, importantly, under this 45Z credit, USDA's technical guidance was that you could choose one or more of those CSA practices in order to have your corn, soybeans, and sorghum qualify or at least get a more favorable carbon intensity score relative to biofuel production. So that was a very important change because under the SAF credit, that really limited the universe of acres available to probably 20 million or maybe just a little bit more, because that was the level of total cover crop acres in the United States. So, we've really expanded at least the possible universe of crops that can be produced using these CSA practices. We're probably getting in more of the 100 million plus acres out of the roughly, 300 million crop acres we have in this country. There's still a little ways to go, if you will, but at least for these production practices, them only having to do one or more really helps out the farmer. Now, of course, the no-till would be the probably most carbon favorable option relative to a tillage practice. Reduced tillage means there are still probably more than one trip across those same acres. And that, of course, the more trips, the more fuel, the more disturbing of the soil, that releases carbon, that lowers the carbon intensity benefit of that tillage practice. But there is a fair amount of both no-till and reduced-till acres that are out there in the United States. So we've got a broader universe, at least now, of what's available. Now, as I mentioned before, when we look at the 45Z credit, it's being paid out to the biofuel producer. Now, they have to decide what are they going to pay the farmer to grow the corn, soybeans, and sorghum that have these more favorable carbon intensity scores. There's also another component to this that is going to be critically important moving forward. Of course, when we come to these CSA practices, the farmer has to keep records of exactly on a field by field basis what actions or what activities are they undertaking relative to their production system. In other words, how many times are they making tillage passes over that field? How many times have they gone over it relative to planting the crop? Application of any chemicals. Those are all things that count in this carbon intensity figuring that goes toward that score that helps their crop provide a more favorable outlook for that biofuel producer. So they've got to keep all of these records. Now, under the 45Z credit, there is a third-party verification system that has been put in place as a result of this. In other words, the farmer has to keep the information, but that information still has to be verified by someone other than the farmer and the biofuel producer. So in essence, we've now got a cottage industry, if you will, of folks in this verification process. Well, they become an extremely important part for that biofuel producer because, of course, their verification is what provides that biofuel producer with the evidence they need to say, my biofuel has a carbon intensity score of X relative to at least a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that's required under the 45Z credit. So that third-party verifier is very important. Well, obviously, not only does that biofuel producer have to decide what can I pay the farmer to reward him for growing these crops that provide this favorable carbon intensity score, but they also have to pay that third-party verifier. And that party becomes a very important piece of this puzzle. And of course, the biofuel producer has to, work out in their own estimation, what do I need to make a profit in producing this biofuel in order to be able to claim that 45Z credit. So there's a lot of moving parts that are going to go into the decision-making process by these biofuel producers ahead, Ryan.
No, that's really good to know. And I mean, going back to the blender's tax credit, we get a lot of questions in terms of, can that come back? Where does that sit in this whole process? Or at the end of 2024, that became a non-event.
It ended at the end of 2024, so it is not in place right now. The 45Z production credit was established by law in the Inflation Reduction Act. So a regulatory action or a regulatory halt by the Trump administration, will not end the 45Z credit. What that regulatory pause that this administration announced does is that any rule or regulation that was not finalized or had not become effective yet is going to be reviewed by the agency. Now, going into this administration, we already knew, based on the dates included in what was published by the Treasury Department and by USDA, that both the 45Z regulation and those climate smart agriculture practices, the interim final rule from USDA, both of those have to be finalized by the Trump administration. Now, there are some people that are talking about, well, the Trump administration will just do away with it. Well, that's not quite possible again, because 45Z is set in law. It would take Congress to step in. We have seen it mentioned in some of the legislative possibilities that are being discussed in the Republican Party using what's called budget reconciliation to move the Republican agenda forward. That is also raising questions on the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, but there's a lot of support in Republican circles for this 45Z production credit because it has, again, replaced that biodiesel credit, which was very popular with a lot of agriculture producers and a lot of agriculture farm state lawmakers. So you've got a credit that's very, very popular, that's going to be very popular. In the documentation I've seen thus far about potential things, the Inflation Reduction Act is mentioned of, repealing it, except there are certain rules or certain portions that have been set aside, if you will, including that 45Z credit. Now, that's not to say it may not be changed by Congress as they go through that budget reconciliation process. But the Trump administration, with the stroke of the pen, cannot end the 45Z credit as we know it. Likewise, it would also take legislation to bring back that blender's credit. Because again, that ended at the end of 2024. So it would have to take a legislative effort to bring that back. Now, prior to the 45Z credit information that we've got to date being issued, there had been some introducing of legislation that would resume or keep that biodiesel credit in place, but set it so that the biofuel producer could claim either the 45Z credit or the biodiesel credit, not both. In other words, you can't double dip, which is usually the case in many government programs. So, yes, that could be a possibility, but I think right now the attention is really on 45Z. What does this administration do to finalize the rules on 45Z? And what do they do in finalizing the rules on climate smart agriculture practices that would contribute to biofuel producers getting a more favorable carbon intensity score for their biofuel because of the practices the farmer takes? That in turn increases the level of 45Z credit that they would be able to claim.
Okay. So in terms of further guidance and timelines here to create some more certainty in an uncertain environment, any expectations in terms of what folks should be looking for?
Well, I think we're going to be looking at, at least a couple of months down the road, really, because that was the comment period on the CSA practices from USDA. Treasury did not give any guidance on when they would be issuing this regulation on 45Z. That 60 to 90-day period pause by the Trump administration comes into play here. So we're probably not looking until getting potentially some more clarity well past April, perhaps maybe into the summer months. And we could also see this moving in tandem or at the same time as other biofuel policy decisions from this administration. So we're going to be learning a lot about what this administration thinks relative to biofuel policy over the next 3 to 6 months.
No, that's perfect. Anything else that we missed here that we need to clarify as it relates to biofuels policy here in the near term?
Well, I think, right now, the interim guidance from the Treasury Department is what's out there. There was really no way yet for anybody to claim a credit under 45Z. So, it's created a lot more uncertainty. And unfortunately, until we get this information from the Trump administration, until we get some legislative action potentially on, the part of Congress and what do they do, we're in sort of an uncertain period that is not going to be resolved for the next few months.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, thanks for joining us today, Roger. I would say and advise any of our clients to continue to look out for policy analysis as well. We will continue to watch and cover this extensively as it's fairly important to all of the oil seeds that are out there. So thanks for taking the time. Thanks for watching. And we look forward to touching base again once we've got some more clarity as it relates to this credit.